Donald Trump was armed with a black marker and a devastating ledger of facts when he decided it was time to confront Ilhan Omar head-on. He had been in the middle of reciting financial manipulation statistics during a White House press briefing when she suddenly entered the room without an invitation. As the Secret Service agents instinctively moved to intercept her, the president simply waved them away. Reaching into his jacket, he produced a black Sharpie, placing it deliberately on the lectern right beside an empty piece of paper before locking eyes with her. He instructed his security to let her stay, noting that he had been anticipating this exact moment. That pristine sheet of paper was destined to be filled very quickly. Her entrance was noisy, which proved to be her initial miscalculation. This wasn't because being loud equates to being weak, but rather because broadcasting your presence signals to everyone that you are putting on a theatrical show, and a performance requires a willing audience to succeed. In reality, 50% of the reporters present had already mentally drafted their front-page stories before she even uttered a single syllable. Mr. President Omar's voice projected clearly from the media area, its sharp tone echoing all the way to the rear wall. She accused him of weaponizing the presidential podium to target her specific community. She claimed he had insulted her people on nationwide television and reminded the room of his past remarks, suggesting she return to her homeland. Furthermore, she declared him the most heavily scrutinized executive leader in the nation's history, alleging he was currently exploiting government assets to execute a personal revenge campaign against an active congressional representative. The lenses of the press corps pivoted rapidly between the two figures, resembling eager spectators at a heavyweight boxing weigh-in. The journalists in the room could sense the shift. This was no longer going to be a standard informational briefing. This was going to be prime-time footage. Trump observed her steadily. He didn't appear infuriated, nor did he seem caught off guard. Instead, he carried the demeanor of a man who had just been served precisely the opportunity he had requested. Addressing her as Congresswoman, he leaned into the microphone with the casual familiarity of a mechanic leaning under the hood of a car, acting as though he had navigated this exact scenario thousands of times. He expressed genuine appreciation for her unexpected arrival. He noted that because she was there, he no longer had to simply talk about her. Gesturing with the Sharpie, he stated he could now speak directly to her. He removed the cap from the marker, the sharp clicking sound reverberating across the marble surfaces of the room. $1 billion, he announced. He allowed the massive figure to hang in the air, giving the audience a moment to truly comprehend its weight. $1 billion is a phenomenally difficult sum to visualize, and he was intentionally providing them the silence needed to try. He elaborated that this was the exact amount that her state's federal prosecutors, not his, but hers claimed had been siphoned away from public assistance programs in Minnesota. He emphasized that this occurred in her home state, right within her legislative district. Omar's jaw tensed almost imperceptibly. It was the sort of microscopic reaction you would only notice if you were actively searching for it. And the camera operators were undoubtedly zooming in to capture every detail. He continued by detailing the Feeding Our Future scandal, citing $250 million involved, 78 individuals indicted, and 57 ultimately convicted. He labeled it the most significant pandemic-era financial deception in American history, stressing again that it unfolded entirely in her political backyard. He lifted the previously blank page, pressing it flat against the slanted top of the podium. His hand remained completely stable, displaying the steadiness of someone reviewing an invoice they have firmly resolved to dispute. He made it clear that this massive sum was merely the prelude. He listed egregious offenses, child care facilities, submitting invoices for phantom children, healthcare programs, billing for perfectly healthy individuals, and specialized therapy centers operating without any actual patients. Funds specifically allocated to nourish vulnerable youth, actual children who desperately relied on a daily meal, were instead diverted to purchase luxury SUVs, prime coastal real estate in Kenya, and international flight tickets. Tapping the podium for emphasis, he referenced a direct quote from a Minnesota federal prosecutor, stating that as much as half of the $18 billion in federal aid dispatched to the state since 2018 might have been misappropriated. Half of $18 billion. The phrase struck the quiet room with the heavy thud of a cinder block hitting a tile floor. The rhythmic clicking of laptop keyboards ceased entirely as journalists exchanged stunned glances. Moving methodically, Trump inscribed the first note onto the paper. He maintained his gaze on her, refusing to look down at his hand. He asked her if she knew what such actions were called in the business world. He answered his own question, defining it as theft uncomplicated, standard theft of the variety that results in a windowless cell and an inmate number. As Omar parted her lips to interject, Trump seamlessly powered through. Shifting his attention to the reporters, his vocal tone softened and lightened, adopting the engaging cadence of a storyteller approaching the punchline. He recounted a recent, pleasant meeting with the Somalian president, describing him affectionately. During this beautiful diplomatic exchange, Trump claimed he jokingly offered to return Congresswoman Omar. Shrugging his shoulders, Trump delivered the punchline. The foreign leader supposedly declined the offer, stating they already possessed enough difficulties. A wave of suppressed amusement washed over the press pool. Several reporters bit their lips to maintain professionalism, while a couple of camera operators openly smiled from behind their equipment. Trump insisted it was a totally factual narrative. Omar remained standing in the media area, entirely devoid of the structural authority of a podium, a microphone, or prepared notes. She had only her physical presence and her vocal cords. She tightly grasped the back of the seat ahead of her, her hands desperate for a solid anchor, yet nothing around her conferred official status or indicated she belonged in that specific space. She had invaded his domain, and the atmosphere in the room reflected that power dynamic. Glancing at the fresh ink on his paper, Trump noted the single line representing $1 billion. He was far from finished. He was merely establishing his foundation. Beginning his offensive with cold statistics was a calculated architectural choice. It is impossible to accuse a financial ledger of bigotry. You cannot leverage a victim narrative against a cleared bank transaction. It is futile to stand beside a billion-dollar crater in the national treasury and insist that investigating it constitutes religious prejudice. Mathematical figures exist in an absolute realm where deflections fail, shields crumble, and empty allegations miss their mark. They simply exist, stark and undeniable, much like a past due notice resting on a dining table. He launched his argument from this numerical bedrock because he understood, just as a master builder identifies a critical support beam, that once these indisputable figures were established, any subsequent defense she attempted would be built upon a foundation of sand. This wasn't a personal smear campaign, it was a forensic accounting, and balance sheets are entirely indifferent to one's birthplace. Refusing to yield, Omar escalated her volume. She accused him of falling back on his predictable tactics. Her voice rose sharply enough to cause a nearby journalist to physically wince. She charged him with systematically attacking women of her faith, immigrants, and minorities. She reiterated her grievances about his past insults and his rallies where crowds chanted for her removal. She vehemently declared that his actions were not administrative oversight, but rather pure prejudice, broadcasted from the globe's most influential stage. She delivered these accusations with the force of pulling a heavy emergency alarm, a deliberate maneuver engineered to violently wrench the narrative away from the financial facts and refocus it entirely on the identity of the person questioning them. The room grew completely still. Every media professional present was intimately familiar with this strategic playbook. In the arena of American governance, leveling an accusation of prejudice acts as a blinding flashbang. The instant it detonates, all prior dialogue vanishes, and the entire discourse centers exclusively on the explosive charge itself. It is a reality that every elected official in the Capitol understands and deeply dreads. Trump, however, retrieved his marker. He operated outside the conventional boundaries of standard politicians. Acknowledging her pivot with a double tap of the Sharpie on the wood, He agreed to shift the topic to spoken words. He kept his volume measured and steady. He offered no frantic self-defense, nor did he utter the standard denial of harboring prejudice. He simply bypassed the explosive allegation entirely, stepping over it with the casual indifference one might show a shallow puddle on the pavement, acknowledging its presence but refusing to let it impede his stride. He transported the room back to the tragic events of September 2001. Locking eyes with her, he invoked the memory of 3,000 lost citizens. He spoke of the first responders who charged into collapsing towers, the mothers bidding final farewells to their children from hijacked flights, and the individuals facing unthinkable choices high above the ground as flames engulfed the structures. Pausing for maximum gravity, he pointed out that she, an elected representative of the United States, stood before an audience and summarized that monumental tragedy as merely some people did something. The atmosphere in the room grew suffocatingly dense. He repeated her infamous phrasing with the profound disbelief of someone reading an impossibly incorrect price tag. He reminded her that those 3,000 fallen Americans had names, and that their identities were permanently etched into bronze memorials for anyone to trace with their hands. Some people, he echoed again bitterly. In the front row, a journalist placed his writing instrument on his notepad, opting to merely witness the unfolding drama rather than document it. Omar briefly broke eye contact, her gaze darting to the carpet for a fraction of a second before snapping back up. She raised her chin defensively, as if hoisted by an invisible wire, yet her eyes betrayed a momentary lag. Her posture was desperately attempting to reclaim the defiant ground that her expression had already yielded. Trump's cadence remained steady, adopting the methodical rhythm of an auditor reading line items from a lengthy receipt. There was no heated fury, merely a clinical inventory of past statements. He highlighted another instance where her rhetoric had crossed a line, reminding her of the time she suggested that Jewish Americans, descendants of those who survived history's darkest atrocities, only supported Israel due to financial bribery. He quoted her directly, "It's all about the Benjamins, baby." He stressed that these were her exact words, published on her official account, not a fabrication by a conservative network or a nameless internet troll. Ticking the points off on his fingers, he reminded her that her own political faction had forcefully reprimanded her. He pointed out that Nancy Pelosi, a leader who generally aligned with her ideology, forced her to issue a public, televised apology because her commentary was so exceptionally vile. He etched 2 additional sentences onto his paper, the abrasive scratching of the felt tip against the grain piercing the total silence like a sharp object dragged across a pane of glass. Building to his next point, Trump expressed sheer disbelief at the subsequent consequences she faced. He detailed how 218 congressional members voted to strip her of her position on the Foreign Affairs Committee. He clarified that this was an act of Congress, not an executive order. Her own colleagues, individuals she shared meals with and passed in the hallways, determined she was too untrustworthy to hold that specific clearance. With a decisive 218 to 211 vote, they revoked her access, a margin he described as clear and unambiguous. Holding the marker in his hand, he challenged her definition of religious discrimination. He declared that true prejudice does not look like a nation rescuing an 8-year-old girl from an African refugee settlement and elevating her to the highest legislative body in the land. That, he stated, is what this allegedly terrible and prejudiced nation provided for her. In return, he argued, she showed her gratitude by minimizing the deadliest attack on American soil. He demanded she never again lecture him about prejudice within the walls of his press briefing room. Omar pressed her hands firmly against her sides, her fingertips digging into the material of her clothing. An assistant stationed closely behind her attempted to offer a reassuring touch on her shoulder. She swiftly and subtly rejected the gesture. The rapid movement communicated volumes. She wasn't seeking consolation, she needed conversational weaponry, and her reserves were dangerously depleted. Deploying accusations of prejudice is a strategy wholly dependent on the opposition accepting the defensive posture. Once that tactic is utilized, the entire dynamic shifts, transforming the accused into the one on trial and the accuser into the ultimate moral arbiter. The dialogue pivots violently away from factual evidence and focuses entirely on personal morality. The vast majority of political figures understand this mechanism and live in absolute dread of it. But the man behind the podium did not adhere to those standard fears. Instead of issuing a frantic denial of bigotry, he simply read her own documented statements back to her. Written records possess no demographic identity, they are neutral ink on a page, and the page in question bore her name prominently at the header. The atmosphere drastically shifted as Omar altered her approach. She abandoned the high-volume outrage, replacing it with a quiet, measured, and significantly more intense delivery. Staring directly at the president, she recounted her harrowing personal history. She detailed surviving a brutal national conflict, enduring 4 years in a displacement camp as a child, and arriving on American soil completely destitute. She proudly highlighted her achievement of securing a congressional seat twice. Drawing a sharp contrast, she targeted his privileged upbringing, noting he was raised in immense wealth and had never experienced a single moment of genuine deprivation. With a remarkably steady hand, she pointed aggressively in his direction. She firmly commanded that he possessed no authority to dictate her American identity to her. For a fleeting second, the energy in the room seemed to sway in her favor. Trump refrained from touching his writing instrument. He observed her, and when he finally responded, his tone had morphed. It was deeper, stripped of any theatrical flourish or attempts to play to the gallery. He sincerely acknowledged that her journey, the young girl escaping a camp and rising from nothing in America, was one of the most remarkable narratives the nation had ever fostered. He emphatically stated that stories like hers represent the very foundation of the country's existence. Then, his grip returned to the Sharpie. He brutally pivoted, asserting that her inspiring backstory did not grant her indefinite immunity. He told her she could not weaponize the darkest chapters of her youth as a blank check to excuse all of her subsequent adult behavior. This rhetorical turn slammed shut with the finality of a heavy door echoing down a silent corridor. He immediately transitioned back to financial ledgers, revealing that her political campaign had funneled $2.8 million into a consulting agency owned by her husband. He emphasized that these financial transfers skyrocketed by 700% during the exact same financial quarter their romantic relationship began, a time when he was still legally wed to another woman. Trump noted the subsequent Election Commission complaints and the demands from her own political allies to cease the practice. He pointed out that she only terminated the arrangement after nearly $3 million had already vanished. Omar's posture stiffened momentarily before gradually bowing, resembling a structural beam buckling under an unmanageable load. Trump then highlighted what he sarcastically termed his favorite, most unbelievable detail. He explained that her partner utilized those campaign funds to establish a California vineyard. That same enterprise was subsequently hit with a massive fraud lawsuit by a financial backer who had been guaranteed a 300% return on investment. Adding insult to injury, the business also allegedly owed over $1 million to agricultural crop cultivators in the Midwest. Leaning intimately close to the microphone, Trump quipped that he had witnessed more viable corporate strategies from the first season cast of his reality television show. He joked that a contestant pitching bottled oxygen had a more solid financial outline. Spontaneous, jagged laughter erupted from the press pool, a sound the journalists desperately tried to stifle, but ultimately failed to contain. Trump then pivoted his body away from Omar, addressing the closest television camera head-on. He bypassed the journalists in the room, broadcasting directly to the citizens watching from their homes. He spoke to the millions of immigrants tuning in who had navigated the complex legal immigration process. He praised those who had patiently waited, studied rigorously for their exams in secondary languages, and sincerely swore their allegiance to the nation. He honored the people working exhausting double shifts, ferrying their children to early morning classes, and meticulously paying every single cent of their required taxes. He forcefully declared that not a single one of those hard-working individuals had ever secretly diverted millions of community dollars into their spouse's private business venture. Those everyday citizens, he proclaimed, were the people he truly represented, not the individuals exploiting the bureaucratic machinery for personal gain. Omar physically deflated, her shoulders sagging noticeably, her arms hung limply, and this time, when her assistant gently grasped her arm, she offered no resistance, keeping her gaze firmly fixed on the floorboards. The undeniable momentum of the room had violently swung back, the energy pooling heavily around the presidential lectern. Trump painted a vivid, hypothetical picture of a hard-working, immigrant small business owner, a woman who spent decades running a dry cleaning service after arriving with nothing but a toddler and limited luggage. He noted that this archetypal citizen never cried racism to avoid accountability, never defended terrorist actions, and never demanded preferential treatment. She was intimately familiar with grueling manual labor and the stress of manually calculating personal taxes, but completely ignorant of high-level political consulting firms. While this citizen didn't explicitly need the president to advocate for her, in that specific moment, she was finally being represented and seen on the national stage. The clock was expiring on the confrontation, a reality Omar acutely recognized. The briefing would conclude exactly when the president decided, and he was currently preparing to deliver his final, most damaging arguments. With a voice fracturing from genuine structural strain rather than theatrical affectation, she accused him of labeling her human refuse. She reminded him of his claims that her birth nation rejected her, and that he desired to strip her of her citizenship and forcefully exile an elected official. She framed the entire ordeal as the inevitable persecution a minority woman of her faith faces when daring to confront the globe's most formidable executive. She insisted that bigotry was the sole driving force behind the entire spectacle. Trump lifted the marker once more. Every eye in the room tracked the movement. Everyone understood the terrifying implication. He was not finished. He was simply moving to the final chapter. Lowering his voice to the grim, clinical tone of a medical examiner detailing a fatal injury, he instructed her to take a seat, signaling he had crucial information to impart. She stubbornly remained upright, though her rigidly locked joints suggested that merely staying on her feet had become an exhausting task. Glancing from his notes directly into her eyes, he initiated his final barrage. He brought up the deeply controversial 2009 marriage to a man named Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi. He emphasized that numerous individuals from her own tight-knit community, childhood acquaintances, and former dinner guests had gone on the public record, claiming this man was actually her biological sibling. He stressed that this wasn't a baseless rumor he fabricated, but documented statements from her own former peers. He dragged the Sharpie across the paper, the slow, deliberate strokes echoing loudly, mimicking the action of highlighting a catastrophic error in a legal document. He exposed the fact that she had submitted joint federal tax documents with the biological father of her children during the exact same time frame she was legally bound in matrimony to the other man. Two separate men, conflicting tax submissions, identical years. Admitting he lacked a law degree, he nonetheless asserted he understood the severe repercussions ordinary citizens face when they falsify government tax forms. Standard citizens don't get the privilege of defending themselves on a televised stage. They are subjected to brutal audits, receive intimidating correspondence, and eventually find themselves in bleak interrogation rooms facing humorless federal agents. Omar clutched the chair in front of her so intensely that the metal visibly warped beneath her grip. The blood drained entirely from her knuckles, a physiological response to desperately clinging to a physical object when everything abstract is rapidly disintegrating. Trump pressed forward, detailing her 2017 divorce proceedings, where she swore to a judge under the severe threat of perjury charges that she had absolutely no idea how to locate her legal husband. He allowed a perfectly calibrated, agonizing half-second pause to let the perjury threat resonate. He then revealed that investigators had unearthed her personal social media archives. Using her own private pseudonym, they discovered photographic evidence of her happily posing alongside that very same man in the United Kingdom, completely contradicting her sworn legal testimony from 2 years later. The briefing room achieved a state of profound, unprecedented silence. All typing ceased. Digital devices were lowered, and when a writing implement tumbled to the floor, not a single person dared to retrieve it. The faint hum of the ventilation system and the aggressive scratching of the marker were the only audible sounds. He informed her that the Department of Justice was actively retrieving her comprehensive immigration dossier. He disclosed that specialized federal teams had been analyzing those specific documents for several months. He cited a prominent senator who had already outlined 3 distinct federal criminal violations: fraudulent marriage, immigration, deception, and lying under oath, each carrying potential half-decade prison sentences, massive financial penalties, and the ultimate threat of exile. Snatching a microphone from a nearby journalist station, Omar frantically shouted that every single one of those allegations had been thoroughly debunked by independent investigators. Trump maintained his icy composure. Placing the marker down, he fixed her with the exhausted, unyielding stare of a property owner dealing with a severely delinquent occupant who is still attempting to debate the lease agreement. "Then take the test," he challenged. A suffocating, heavy silence descended. He laid out the parameters, a single genetic swab, taking a mere 5 seconds. He noted that a wealthy individual had publicly offered $1 million bounty and a luxury sports vehicle if she could definitively prove the man in question was not her sibling. 5 seconds, one simple medical swab, and a definitive answer that would silence the controversy permanently. He demanded to know why she refused to clear her name so easily. She gripped the audio equipment tightly. She applied pressure to the activation switch. Yet no defense materialized from her lips. "You won't do it," Trump stated, his voice completely stripped of any performative inflection or comedic timing. He spoke simply as a man finalizing a damning conclusion. He stated that she refused because they both knew exactly what she was guilty of. Furthermore, he asserted that in the quiet, untelevised corners of her mind, she fully realized that her secrets were entirely compromised. The rapid rise and fall of Omar's chest was evident from across the room. Her head bowed in defeat. The stolen microphone dangled uselessly from her grip until the journalist carefully retrieved his property. She offered zero resistance, allowing her hands to fall empty at her sides. Trump finalized his handwritten list, hoisting the paper to display it to the flashing cameras. Every bold black line represented a devastating factual strike. The document, completely pristine upon her arrival, was now densely covered in her controversies. Placing the ledger back on the podium, he offered her one final look before firmly replacing the cap on his marker with a decisive click. He delivered his final blow, stating that she hadn't immigrated to the nation to become a true citizen, but rather to exploit one. The room remained entirely frozen. Every statistic, every estimated dollar amount, every allegation jotted down on that paper was already established public knowledge. The audience tuning into this confrontation was entirely aware of the details before the broadcast even commenced. They weren't watching to be educated on new developments. They were watching because they possessed a deep, unfulfilled desire to witness someone finally vocalize these truths directly to her face. They needed to see someone deliver the facts without offering immediate apologies, without freezing when she deployed her standard defensive tactics, and without cowering when the recording devices were active. This phenomenon is the true core of the issue, far beyond the specific details of the allegations. The entire catalog of her controversies has been accessible to the masses for years. The familial marriage rumors erupted nearly a decade ago. The video minimizing a national tragedy has circulated endlessly online. Her questionable financial campaign documents are hosted on public government servers for anyone to scrutinize. The massive local fraud statistics have been cemented in official court transcripts for years. Nothing discussed in that room was a newly unearthed secret. The pressing question is why it felt so revolutionary for someone to simply state the obvious. The answer lies in the fact that the journalistic and political apparatus designed to investigate such matters is equipped with a highly sensitive kill switch. That emergency shutoff is the accusation of prejudice. The very second an investigator dares to inquire about the suspicious funds, the contradictory marital documents, or the bizarre tax filings, the accusation is hurled, and all inquiries immediately cease. This isn't due to the questions lacking merit. It happens because the individuals asking the questions are utterly terrified of being branded with a career-ending label. When the broadcast ends, self-preservation dictates that remaining silent and pivoting to a new topic is simply the safest, most economical choice. Consequently, legitimate concerns stockpile in private conversations, debated over dinner tables, and in secure group chats. They fester without resolution, while the subject of these concerns utilizes a prominent platform to rebrand essential accountability as an expression of pure hatred. This is the entrenched methodology of the capital, and while Omar didn't invent this defensive machinery, she has piloted it with unparalleled efficiency. The core dilemma extends far beyond a single Congresswoman. The true danger is the protective mechanism itself, the impenetrable shield that magically transforms necessary financial audits into targeted bigotry and standard legal oversight into religious persecution. This tactic has flourished for years because those tasked with seeking the truth prioritize their livelihoods, worry about their public perception among their families, and fear being disgraced in the morning papers. Average, law-abiding citizens, regardless of their origin, ethnicity, or background, are forced to navigate life playing strictly by the established rules. They diligently file accurate taxes, endure long lines at municipal buildings, and stress over basic utilities. If any ordinary individual was caught submitting fraudulent federal documents, marrying a relative to bypass immigration laws, or laundering political donations into a spouse's bank account, they would absolutely not be permitted to stand before the press and dismiss the ensuing criminal probe as an act of intolerance. They would be sitting silently in a courtroom, awaiting sentencing. This hypocritical double standard is not an abstract concept. It is a frustrating, observable reality for countless individuals who consume the daily news and internally question how she maintains her position of power. However, mathematical figures are immune to intimidation tactics. Financial receipts adhere to no religious doctrine. An employee's pay stub is incapable of harboring prejudice. And demanding accountability regarding the allocation of massive sums of money is an intrinsic right belonging to every taxpayer, shareholder, and citizen in the country. It is a question they should be allowed to ask without seeking prior committee approval or fearing that their pursuit of truth will result in public defamation. The lingering uncertainty isn't whether justice will eventually catch up to the evidence, as the proof has been hiding in plain sight for a significant period. The true mystery is why it required a figure who completely rejects the standard rules of political decorum, a man who refuses to halt his interrogation when the defensive traps are sprung, and who remains entirely unfazed by vicious labeling to publicly articulate the exact frustrations that millions of Americans have been whispering in private for years. Perhaps the ultimate conclusion is remarkably straightforward. The deeply flawed, hypersensitive political ecosystem required an antagonist who fundamentally did not care about the ecosystem's opinions or its protective labels. And during that dramatic afternoon exchange in the White House briefing room, armed with nothing but a black marker and a piece of paper, the system finally collided with that exact person. That piece of paper was certainly not blank anymore.